I had been sleeping in cars since the 6th day. My flat in Inala was gone before the first week was up. 3 men came through the building on the 3rd night and told everyone on the 2nd floor to leave. They did not ask. They had a dog, 2 long knives, and a tone that meant the decision was already made. I went out through the bathroom window onto the fire escape, dropped to the alley with my work bag and my backpack, and that was the last time I was inside a building with walls I trusted. For 5 weeks after that, I moved constantly. 1 night in a drainage tunnel, 2 nights in a hardware store before the smell got too bad, the rest in abandoned vehicles along the back roads south and east of the city. The sick were everywhere by then, though people were still arguing about what to call them. I heard ferals from a man I met near the Ipswich Road overpass. I heard the turn from a woman boarding up a servo. I heard rotters from a bloke who had clearly watched too many films. I started calling them shamblers, which was what my old neighbor Alf had called them before he became one. The name did not matter. What mattered was that they followed noise. They did not stop for pain, and if they got hold of you, you did not come back whole. By week 6, I had a routine. I moved at dawn and at dusk, rested mid-morning and mid-afternoon when the shamblers were densest in the heat. I ate canned food, whatever I could pull from stores that others had already half cleared. I had a system for entering any building, check windows for movement, listen at the door for 30 seconds, tap once with a knuckle and wait. If something answered, I left. If nothing answered, I went in quiet and fast. I was not proud of everything I had done to stay fed. I broke into a chemist and took antibiotics I did not need yet. I took a sleeping bag from a car belonging to a family who had not made it. I went through a dead man's pockets on the Beaudesert Road and took his lighter, his folding knife, and $22 in cash, which was useless, but I took it anyway out of habit. There was a version of me from before all this that would have felt something about those choices. That version was gone by week 3. The biggest threat in those first weeks was not the sick. It was other people who had decided that being useful was less important than being armed. I ran into 2 groups that had set up at service stations. Both had weapons, both had food, and both made it clear within the first 30 seconds of conversation that they were not interested in adding anyone to their arrangement. I did not push it either time. Pushing it looked like the wrong move when the other side had a shotgun and you had a hammer. There was one group, a cluster of about 9 people camped in a primary school in Forest Lake, who let me in for 2 nights in week 4. They had clean water from a tank, a cooking fire, and a rotation of watches through the night. I contributed what I could. I helped them reinforce a fence line and showed them how to rig a simple noise alarm on the gate using a tin can and some wire. On the 3rd morning, their leader, a heavy-set woman named Bet, who had run a landscaping crew before all this, told me they were pulling out east and offered me a place in the convoy. I thought about it for an hour and said no. I did not trust my own reasons for saying no. I just said it. I spent the 2 weeks after Forest Lake almost entirely alone. I saw people at a distance, a man on a bicycle who did not stop, a woman watching from a window who ducked back when I looked up, a pair of teenagers running along a fence line, with packs on who I let pass without showing myself. I watched all of them and let all of them go. Every person you bring in is a variable you did not plan for, and I was already carrying enough of those. I found the bridge on what I believed was a Thursday, 8 weeks in. I kept a count of days in a small notebook after losing track completely in the 2nd week and waking up in a stranger's car not knowing whether it was morning or afternoon. The bridge was a section of the Gateway motorway crossing a wide concrete creek channel about 12 kilometers south of the city. It was long and low, 2 traffic spans side by side, the creek sitting about 6 meters below the road deck. I was moving along the creek bed on foot when I looked up and saw the access structure. Most motorway bridges have maintenance catwalks and service cavities built into the concrete span. Not many people know that. I knew it because I had spent 2 years doing graffiti removal on bridge infrastructure for Brisbane City Council, which meant I had been inside more bridge structures than most people see in a lifetime. The maintenance cavities on this span were good ones, wide enough to stand in sideways, running the full length of the deck, accessible from a service ladder mounted to the inside face of the central pier. The ladder ran from a small concrete landing just above the normal floodline up to a steel access door in the soffit of the deck. I stood in the creek bed for a few minutes looking at it. The central pier sat in the middle of the creek channel. Getting to it meant wading across, which was easy at ankle depth. The ladder was vertical, bolted with steel brackets, old enough for rust stains, but solid enough to hold weight. The access door at the top had a padlock that had been there long enough to corrode at the shackle. 3 hits with the flat of my hammer, and it opened. Inside was a maintenance corridor about 1.5 meters wide and 2 meters tall, running the length of the span. Dark, smelled of concrete dust and stale air. An electrical conduit ran along one wall, dead because the power grid had been out for weeks. The floor was solid. The walls were solid. I moved along the corridor with my torch until I found the first cross passage, which opened onto a wider inspection platform perpendicular to the span. The platform had a waist-high parapet on the outer edge and looked directly down into the creek channel below. Nobody could see this from the road. Nobody could see it from the creek bank unless they were standing directly underneath and looking up at exactly the right angle. The shamblers would not climb a vertical ladder even if they could find one. They did not problem solve. They moved toward noise. They moved in straight lines when they could manage it, and a bolted steel ladder was too abstract for them. All of this went through my head in about 30 seconds. Then I sat down on the platform floor and ate the last of a tin of baked beans I had been carrying, and thought about what I was looking at. What I was looking at was a place nobody else would find. I came back the next morning with a better torch and a tape measure. The inspection platform was 4 meters by 2.5. The maintenance corridor ran 11 meters. The ceiling height inside was enough to sleep lying flat. The access ladder had 12 rungs from the creek landing to the underside door. There was a secondary access hatch at the far end of the corridor, bolted from inside, that I would need to force open, but it was manageable. I spent most of that day sitting and listening. I had been acting first my whole life. This once, I forced myself to plan. The platform needed a floor covering and somewhere to sleep. I needed water storage. The maintenance area had none. I needed a cooking setup that would not fill the corridor with smoke. Most importantly, I needed a rope ladder, or equivalent that I could pull up behind me, because the fixed service ladder was discoverable, and discoverable meant a problem eventually, and I needed to move enough material up a 12-rung vertical ladder to make all of it work without drawing attention from above or below. The first material run took 4 days. I found timber in a construction yard about 2 kilometers east, framing lengths, sheets of ply, a roll of heavy black plastic sheeting. I moved what I could carry per trip, down the creek bed at dusk. Getting the timber up the ladder was the first real problem. A 3-meter length of framing timber does not go up a vertical ladder easily. I ended up tying a line to the top rung and hauling pieces up hand over hand from the landing below, which required constant back and forth between positions and took longer than I expected for every load. The rope ladder came together on the 3rd day. It was not a proper rope ladder. It was a section of window washing cable cut from a building supplies yard, plus wooden rungs I cut from dowel rod and lashed in place with paracord from a camping shop. It took a full day to make and it was ugly, but it worked. The top attached to a steel ring I bolted into the concrete, and the whole thing coiled flat on the platform. From the creek bed, once the ladder was up, there was nothing visible. No rope, no ladder, no opening, just concrete. I was pleased with myself for longer than was useful. The week after the rope ladder went up, I found a flare pistol in a roadside emergency kit inside a wrecked caravan about 200 meters north along the creek bank. The kit was the kind sold at camping shops. 4 flares, signal mirror, whistle, a small first aid pouch. The flares were the ones that fired from a pen-sized pistol rather than the handheld type. I took the pistol and all 4 flares and put them in a zippered pouch I kept clipped to the pack. I had no plan for them. They were a last resort that I chose not to think about in detail. I also reinforced the rope ladder attachment after the 3rd week. The bolt I had used was a standard M10 eye bolt, and the concrete it was set into was old enough that I did not fully trust it. I drilled a second anchor point 30 centimeters from the first and ran a separate loop of chain through both, so the ladder's weight was distributed across 2 bolts rather than 1. A single point failure would not drop it now. I also added a simple clip system to the base of the rope ladder, a carabiner from the camping shop that allowed me to lock the bottom of the ladder to a fixed bracket when it was raised, so it could not be shaken loose from below even if someone found the pier and tried. Water was the next problem. I found 2 large chemical drums in a landscaping supply yard, the kind used for liquid fertilizer, rinsed and left open. They held about 200 liters each and were too large to move whole. I cut them down the middle lengthwise, hauled the halves separately, and rebuilt them inside the maintenance corridor using a patch kit from a plumbing shop. They were not entirely watertight once reassembled, but they held enough to matter. I ran a section of PVC pipe through a gap in the deck soffit and positioned it to catch runoff from the road drain above. In the first rain after I installed it, the larger drum filled to a third. In the second rain, it filled completely. Cooking was harder. I needed heat without smoke. I found a small camping stove in the wreck of a caravan that had gone off the motorway about 3 kilometers up, along with 3 gas canisters. The stove burned clean at low settings if I kept the corridor cross-ventilated, which I did by cracking the hatch at each end. The small amount of fume that came out dispersed through the bridge structure before reaching open air, and was nothing at the level I was cooking at, just enough to heat a tin. By the end of the 3rd week inside the bridge, I had a sleeping pad of folded plastic sheeting over a timber base, a water supply that refilled in rain, a cooking setup that worked, a rope ladder nobody could find from below, and a food cache that would last a month at careful use. I also had my claw hammer, a length of rebar I had ground to a usable point against concrete, and a slingshot from a forked branch and hardware shop elastic. None of these were impressive. They worked. The shamblers were a constant background problem. The creek carried them. That surprised me the first time. A body moving in the current, arms dragging, head just above the surface, making that low wet sound they all made. Floodwater from upstream brought them down the channel every few days. Most passed under the bridge and kept going. A few snagged on the central pier. One got stuck on the creek landing at 2 in the morning, and I had to deal with it using the rebar because it was making noise against the concrete that I could feel through the platform floor. The motorway above was also a problem. Small groups of shamblers had started using the road surface as a travel corridor by week 4, moving along the guardrails, following each other, sometimes stopping directly above me. I do not know what drew them there. Wind through the bridge structure, possibly. What it meant practically was that the road surface was no longer safe and I stopped going up at all. During the 4th week, I extended the sleeping area. I built a raised bunk inside the corridor above the floor, with storage space beneath. I strung a tarp across the open end of the platform to keep wind and rain off without blocking the ventilation I needed for the stove. I found bicycle chains in a bike shop a kilometer east, and used lengths of them to reinforce the rope ladder attachment points where the paracord lashings had started to fray. I replaced those sections with chain looped through steel rings. I was good at finding things and adapting them. That was always something I could do. It was not a skill anyone had ever valued before, but it had kept me fed for years before any of this started, and now it was keeping me alive. The shelter worked. I had built it alone. Nobody knew it was there. I was more pleased about those facts than I probably should have been. My days in the shelter developed a rhythm. I was up before dawn, which in Brisbane still meant warmth even in the wet season, and I spent the first hour doing small maintenance, checking the water drums, tightening any rope or cable that had shifted overnight, looking over the rope ladder attachment points. Then I would eat something cold from a tin, check the creek in both directions from the platform, and plan the day's movements. On supply run days, I was moving by 6:30 in the morning. I worked a radius of about 3 kilometers from the bridge, which I had divided loosely into sectors. I had already cleared most of what was worth taking from the closest sector, 2 kilometers east along the creek, including the bike shop, the camping goods shop, and the 2 hardware outlets. The farther sectors still had useful material, but required more time and more risk. I got back to the bridge by mid-afternoon on those days, and spent the remaining daylight doing work on the shelter. On no-run days, I stayed in the maintenance corridor and worked on equipment, wrote in the notebook, or slept. Rest was not nothing. By week 4, I had learned that a tired decision and a good decision looked exactly the same in the moment and produced completely different outcomes. I slept deliberately. I ate on a schedule even when I was not hungry. I drank water at set intervals from the drum, rather than waiting until I noticed I needed it. These were habits I had never had before, and forming them in a concrete box above a flood channel was not how I would have expected to pick them up. I saw the first sign of the brothers on a Wednesday in week 5. I was moving along the creek bed at dusk, heading back from a supply run about 2 kilometers east, when I saw the vehicle. A dark blue 4-wheel drive parked sideways across a narrow road bridge that crossed the creek about 400 meters upstream from my position. Strips of corrugated iron were nailed to the railings, angled out to block vehicle passage. Tied to one of the uprights was a hand-painted sign I read through binoculars from behind a concrete pier. The sign read, "Road closed. Toll applies. Wait." I watched for 90 minutes from cover. A man came out from behind the 4-wheel drive twice. Tall, wide in the shoulders, high visibility vest over a dark shirt, a rifle across his back and a machete on his hip. He walked to the railing edge, looked up and down the creek, and went back to the vehicle. Nobody came through while I was watching. At the end of the hour, he climbed back into the cab. The next morning, I went back to a different position and watched again. There were 2 of them. The second was shorter, stockier, shaved head, and a beard that had gone past intentional into overgrown. He came out around 9 carrying 2 mugs of something hot, handed one to the taller man, and they stood at the railing looking north along the road. They talked for several minutes in the easy, settled way of people who had been running the same routine for a while. I did not approach them. The toll sign was not for decoration. People who make those signs mean them, and these 2 had a rifle, a vehicle, and a clear sense of what they were doing. There was no upside I could see in introducing myself. The only vehicle crossing in 3 kilometers was theirs. On foot, going around through the West Bank, scrub added 40 minutes to any supply run east but kept me out of their sightline. From that day, I went around. I learned their names by accident, 3 weeks later. I was lying flat behind a concrete bank riser, about 150 meters downstream from the road bridge, when the shorter man shouted across to the taller one. He called him Darren. 2 days after that, from the same position, I heard Darren call back. He called the shorter one Roy. Darren and Roy. They had a white esky on the bridge deck that they kept topped up. They ate from tins and whatever they collected from road users, fuel from vehicles, food from travelers who paid the toll to keep moving. I watched them extract 2 cans of diesel from a sedan one afternoon. Not by force, by the presence of the rifle. The driver paid and went. The brothers watched him go, then went back to their positions on opposite ends of the bridge. I watched them for parts of 4 more days across the following 2 weeks, always from the lantana stand, or from behind the concrete bank riser downstream. Their routine was consistent. Darren kept the rifle visible at all times. Roy handled most of the direct interaction with people passing through. He did the talking. He set the rate. And from what I could observe, he was better at reading people than his brother. Darren watched. Roy negotiated. It was an efficient arrangement. 3 times while I was watching, someone came through and crossed without incident. Once, a group on foot, 4 adults moving fast, came to the road bridge and turned back when they saw the vehicle and the sign. Roy called to them, but they did not stop. Darren raised the rifle briefly and then lowered it. The group on foot was gone before anything could develop. I noted that Darren had lowered the rifle. I noted that Roy had let them go. There were limits, or there were calculations being made about what was worth the trouble. They were not going anywhere. This was their operation, and they intended to hold it. I went around them every time and tried not to think about what they did when someone could not or would not pay. The scavenger family arrived on a Sunday morning in week 6. I heard them before I saw them, voices, low and careful, carrying under the bridge deck from the far end of the channel. I moved to the outer edge of the platform and looked down. 3 of them, a man in his 50s with a grey beard and a wide-brimmed hat, a woman about the same age in a heavy canvas jacket, a teenager, a boy, 16 or 17 by the look of him, with a large frame pack, walking with his head down. They were moving along the creek bed the same way I did, staying close to the bank, stepping carefully around the water. They stopped under my bridge. The older man sat on a concrete ledge and took off his hat, looked up the creek, looked down the creek, did not look up at the underside of the deck. The woman stretched her back. The boy dropped his pack and sat on a rock. They were exhausted and carrying too much. The pack straps had cut damp marks through the boy's shirt at the shoulders, and the man's left boot was wrapped in duct tape at the toe where the sole was separating. 2 water bottles between 3 people. I thought about calling down to them. I did not do it. Not because I had no reason to, because I could not bring 3 strangers into a single entry shelter with no exit plan if things went wrong. And I did not know these people at all. The shelter existed because nobody knew it was there. Adding 3 more people changed every calculation I had made. I stayed where I was and watched them rest for 20 minutes, then move on downstream. They set up camp about 300 meters downstream under a secondary pedestrian overpass. I found it the next day when I crossed the creek at low water and scouted south along the west bank. They had pitched a small tarp shelter and arranged their packs against the back wall of a concrete abutment. The man was sitting outside reading a field guide to edible plants in southeast Queensland. I got close enough to read the cover and no closer. I checked on the camp 2 days later. Everything looked the same. Tarp up, packs arranged, a small fire ring of creek stones the man had added. The fire ring was a mistake. Smoke from the creek was visible to anyone watching from the road bridge upstream. But it was not my decision to make. I went back to my bridge. On the 3rd day after I first found their camp, I went back and the camp was gone. Not packed up and moved. Gone wrong. The tarp was half down, 1 anchor line pulled free. One of the packs was on its side with the flap open and the contents spread across the ledge. Tins, a first aid kit, a folded map. The small fire ring had been kicked apart. One of the creek stones was cracked across the middle in a way that a hard impact could do. I stood there and looked at it for a long time. I searched for the family for the rest of that day. I did not find them. I found one of the water bottles, empty, wedged under the bank about 40 meters downstream. I found the boy's frame pack with both shoulder straps cut, not torn, cut, about 60 meters past that. Past that, nothing. I walked back to my bridge very carefully, checking the bank behind me at every bend. I could not prove it was Darren and Roy. I had no evidence of anything, but the toll sign was 400 meters upstream. No other group had been moving through this stretch in weeks, and the pack straps had been cut with a blade. I went back to the bridge and sat on the platform for 2 hours without doing anything. Then I started thinking about the girder structure between the 2 deck spans, and what you could attach to it, and where someone coming up from the creek would have to pass. I had done simple traps before. Trip lines along the creek at ankle height, light cables stretched across the access path with a tin of pebbles at one end. Enough noise to wake me without being visible in the dark. What I was thinking now was different. The service girders between the 2 bridge spans ran at about 4 meters of height over the creek channel. They were steel I-beams, wide enough to stand on with care, accessible from the maintenance corridor through a small hatch I had kept bolted shut. The space inside the girder section was dark, lit only by the gap between the 2 deck spans. Nobody outside the bridge structure would know anyone was in there. Anyone approaching the bridge from the creek, wading the channel or climbing from the landing, would pass directly under that inner girder section. I spent most of 2 days rigging the girder section. I used bicycle chain, sections of wire, and 3 pieces of steel angle iron from the construction yard. I set a swing bar rig across the gap at about chest height, attached to the inner face of the left-hand girder, held in place by a bent pin that I could release from above by pulling a cord running up through a gap in the maintenance floor. The bar was heavy enough to be a serious problem for anyone moving through the dark at pace, but light enough that a shambler pressing against it slowly would not trigger the pin. They did not apply steady force. They pressed and released. A person moving with purpose would load it differently. I tested it with a weighted pack dropped from above at various weights, and it triggered reliably above 40 kilograms. I set a second rig at the creek landing itself. This one was simple. A coil of wire at ankle height between the 2 pier faces, both ends tied off. If someone came up the landing in a hurry and did not know the wire was there, they would go down hard on wet concrete, low enough to catch a boot, not low enough to catch a shambler dragging its feet. Both rigs were things I lay awake thinking about after I finished them. They were not designed for shamblers, and I knew it going in. I told myself they were defensive. They were defensive. They were also things I had never thought I would build, and being aware of that did not change the fact that I had built them. I also added something simpler on the creek landing itself. A second trip line set lower than the first, almost at floor level, made from black cable that was nearly invisible against the wet concrete in the dark. The first wire would catch someone moving upright. If they went down and rolled and got back up fast, the second wire was waiting at a different height. I tested both wires 6 times in the dark with my eyes closed, making sure I knew where each one sat and could step over them in the sequence I had memorized. The memorizing was the part I had not expected to matter as much as it did. I knew the bridge structure the way I had once known certain streets in the south side of Brisbane, by feel, by the sound of the floor under my boots, by the height of every hatch and the angle of every ladder rung. That knowledge was what the bridge had given me beyond shelter. In the dark, and in a hurry, knowledge of the ground is worth more than any weapon. Week 8 came in with rain. The creek had been rising since the middle of the previous week, fed by storms somewhere north and west. The channel, which had run at ankle depth when I first found it, was now knee-deep at center and moving faster. The shamblers came down in larger numbers with the current, 4 in one afternoon, 6 the following morning. They snagged on the central pier and piled against each other, making a low, sustained noise I could feel through the platform floor. I dealt with 3 of them from above, dropping through the outer platform gap with the rebar, and working on the ones most solidly stuck. I did not linger. The other 3 cleared the pier on their own as the current picked up. By the 4th day of rising water, the creek landing at the base of the service ladder was submerged, about 20 centimeters, enough to make footing awkward, and enough to mean anyone approaching from the creek level would be wading, not walking. I adjusted the ankle-height wire rig to sit above the new waterline so it would still function. I kept a watch from the platform at intervals through each day, scanning the channel with binoculars. I had been watching for Darren and Roy for 2 weeks with nothing to show for it. They stayed on their road. I stayed under mine. On the 5th day of rain, I found food scraps in the creek downstream. I had gone south to check a hardware shop I had not finished clearing, and on the way back I saw it. Tin labels, fragments of cracker packaging, the torn remains of a plastic bag, caught in a brush tangle about 200 meters downstream from my position. It was my rubbish. I recognized the labels. I had been dropping sealed bags from the south end of the platform, assuming the current would carry them clear, but the current had dropped and the bag had split and left everything visible in a pile. I stood there looking at it and understood immediately that if I could see it, so could anyone else moving along this stretch. I collected every piece I could find and walked back to the bridge, thinking about how long it had been visible. Possibly days. The brush had clearly been accumulating it for a while. I changed my rubbish routine that night. Everything burnable went into the stove in small pieces. Everything else stayed sealed inside the corridor until I could carry it far enough north to leave it somewhere unconnected to my position. But the damage, if there was damage, was already done. They came on the 6th night of the rain. I was awake because the rain on the road deck above was loud and the creek noise had changed. Lower, fuller, faster. I was sitting on the platform edge in the dark listening when I heard something that was not water. A deliberate splash from the direction of the north pier. I kept very still. 2 more splashes, spaced out. 2 people crossing the channel, or 1 person making 2 careful moves. I moved back from the edge and into the maintenance corridor, closed the inner hatch quietly, picked up the pump action from its spot against the wall. It was a short 5-shell weapon I had taken off a dead highway patrolman I found at a petrol station 4 weeks earlier. I had not fired it since. I had practiced the pump enough that I could run it without looking. 2 spare shells in my jacket pocket. I moved to the inner girder hatch and opened it a centimeter. Below in the understructure I heard breathing. Not the open wet breathing of shamblers. Controlled, suppressed. The breathing of someone trying to be quiet. A second set of footsteps joined the first on the creek landing. Someone slipped on the wet concrete and cursed quietly. A man's voice. Then the ankle-height wire caught. There was a heavy impact, the sound of someone going down hard on the landing, then a splash as the impact knocked one leg off the ledge into the water. A second voice said something in a sharp whisper. I could not make out the words. I pulled back from the hatch and moved along the corridor to the cord for the swing bar. I set my hand on it and waited. Below, movement resumed. One of them was climbing. I could hear the fixed service ladder rattling as weight went on it. They had found the ladder, which meant they had found the pier, which meant they had done some scouting beforehand. The rope ladder was up and coiled on the platform above. The service ladder led to the access door in the soffit, which I had relocked from inside. They would reach a locked door at the top. I heard them reach it, a pause, then the sound of something hard against the lock. The second person had recovered from the wire fall and was also climbing. I heard both sets of weight on the ladder frame, which was not built for 2 people and was not happy about it. I went back to the inner girder hatch, opened it fully, and looked down. The understructure was dark but not entirely black. The gap between the deck spans let in enough of the overcast sky to make out shapes. 2 shapes on the service ladder, one at the top working the lock, one just below. I pulled the cord. The swing bar released and moved through the dark understructure and connected with the lower figure on the ladder. A shout, a real one, not a whisper, and the figure came off the ladder. I heard the water. The upper figure stopped working the lock. A head torch came on. The beam swung around the understructure and found the open hatch above. "Up there," the voice said. Darren's voice. I recognized the pitch from 2 weeks of observation. He started climbing again, but the surface above the access door gave him nothing to grip. He was trying to get above the top rung and onto the soffit, but the soffit was flat and wet and he did not have the angle for it. Below in the water, the second figure, Roy, was splashing toward the pier. He had not gone under. He was pulling himself up onto the creek landing, and the voice that came back was tight and controlled, the voice of someone who knew not to go to pieces. I went to the access door to the soffit and braced it. The maintenance corridor door opened inward. If Darren got above it and pulled from outside, he could break the latch. I set a length of framing timber across it, one end against the door, the other against the far corridor wall. The door would not open from outside regardless of how hard someone pulled. Then I went back to the inner hatch and looked down. Roy was back on the landing. He pulled a long metal torch from his jacket and swept it through the understructure. The beam crossed the swing bar, still hanging at the end of its arc. He looked at it for a moment, then looked up at the open hatch. "He's in there," Roy said, not loudly. "There's a hatch." Darren answered from the soffit face above the door. "I know. Can't get the door." Roy swept the torch around the understructure. The beam crossed the rope ladder coiled on the platform edge above. From his angle, he could not make out what it was. Just a shape on the parapet. "There's something up on the platform," he said. I moved back from the hatch to the platform and looked out over the parapet. The rain was heavier now, and the creek had risen another 10 or 15 centimeters in the last hour. It was at the base of the pier now, covering the landing, and the noise it made had changed. Lower, faster, fuller. Whatever was coming from upstream was building into something serious. I had a decision to make and not much time to make it. The rigs had done what they were meant to do. Roy was wet and shaken. Darren was stuck on a wet soffit. Neither could reach me inside the corridor, but neither was leaving. I could still hear them below, talking quietly, working through options. I took my pack from the sleeping area and started moving. Not everything. There was no time for everything. The pump action, 2 spare shells, water bottle, camping stove and 1 gas can, the notebook, the knife, the antibiotics and first aid kit, the binoculars. I left the food tins, I left the second gas can, I left the timber, the tarp, the sleeping mat, and 3 weeks of work. I left the rope ladder coiled on the platform that had taken 2 days to make. I went to the south access hatch, the one I had forced open in the first week, and reseated with internal bolts, and unbolted it. The hatch swung outward onto the outer platform face. The creek below had come up enough that the southern access walkway was wet. Rain was coming in hard and sideways. Below me, Roy's torch moved along the inside of the understructure. He had found another way up, through the inspection gap between the deck spans, somewhere along the inner face of the pier. I heard the inner hatch from the maintenance corridor rattle. He was in the girder section. I went out the south hatch onto the outer platform face. The wind hit immediately, and the rain was cold. The creek below was a different creek from the one I had arrived at 8 weeks before. It had risen another half meter in the time I had been moving, and it was carrying heavy debris, branches, a plastic drum, shapes moving in the current that might have been shamblers, or might have been anything. From behind me, inside the maintenance corridor, the south hatch rattled on its bolt. Roy had gotten into the corridor. I had bolted the hatch from outside as I came through, out of a lifetime of closing doors behind me, and the bolt was on the inside. Roy was working it from his side, and if he got it, the hatch would open. I braced against it. The other end of the platform, the north end, was where Darren would come if he got down from the soffit. The space between me and the rope ladder was the platform deck, 4 meters of open concrete with a waist-high parapet on the outer edge and the corridor wall on the inner side. Nothing to hide behind. The bolt shifted. I felt it move through the door. Roy was strong. I stepped back from the hatch and took the claw hammer from my belt. I had kept it my whole time at the bridge. I held it in my right hand. The hatch opened. Roy came through it fast and low, the way someone moves expecting resistance. He came through with his shoulders and stopped because I was right there. He had the machete. I hit him once with the hammer. It was not controlled, and it was not anything I want to spend time describing. It landed on his shoulder rather than where I had aimed, and he went sideways into the parapet, hit it, and sat down hard on the platform deck. The machete was still in his hand. He was not unconscious. He was reading the situation, not panicking, the right shoulder sitting wrong under the jacket, but the machete still in his left hand, and the calculation still happening behind his eyes. "You're the one in the bridge," he said. "Get up," I said. He got his feet under him slowly. The right arm was not working the way it was supposed to. He kept the machete in his left hand, which meant he was naturally right-handed, and the shoulder had done what I hoped. He looked at the creek below the parapet. It had risen another 20 centimeters since I had come out here. From the north end of the platform, the coiled rope ladder rattled in place. Darren had come down. Roy saw my eyes move and turned. Darren was at the north end, having come through the north hatch or down the service ladder. I did not know which. He had the rifle, 4 meters away. Roy said something I could not catch over the creak noise. Darren raised the rifle. I dropped. The body moves before the decision, and I went sideways behind the parapet as the shot went high over me. The parapet was not built to stop rifle rounds, but it was concrete, and it was there. I pressed flat against the deck. Darren moved. I heard his boots. Roy was still at the south end. 2 directions, no cover between them. I fired the pump action once at the north end of the platform, not at Darren, but at the parapet face in front of him, close enough that the spread made his approach untenable. He pulled back. I used the 2 seconds that bought me to get to my feet, press my back against the inner corridor wall, and rack the next shell. Roy came from the south end in a straight line, machete going left-handed, and I moved sideways along the wall, and he followed the arc of the swing into the outer parapet. The parapet caught him at the hip. On a normal night with the creek at normal level, that would have meant nothing. The parapet was waist height and would have stopped him. The creek had come up another 30 centimeters in the last 10 minutes. The parapet that had sat a meter above the water an hour ago was now 40 centimeters above it. Roy hit the parapet at the hip going forward at speed, and the outer face gave him no grip because it was wet and sloped slightly outward for drainage, and he went over it. I did not see him come back up. The creek below was moving fast and carrying debris, and there were shamblers in it. I had counted 6 or 8 from the platform earlier, moving with the current. In that water, with debris and no footing, and a shoulder that was not working right, a man does not have good odds. I did not watch long enough to see how the odds resolved. Darren was at the north end of the platform. He had not fired again. He was standing behind the coiled rope ladder. Not much cover, but it was what was there. And he was looking at me, and at the south end of the platform. I could not read his expression in the dark and the rain. He said something I could not hear. He said it again, louder. "Where is he?" Not a question. He already knew where Roy was. I said nothing. Darren looked at the parapet edge, and then at me. He slung the rifle and moved to the parapet and looked over. He called Roy's name twice. The creek below answered with noise and debris and nothing else. I went to the north end of the platform and reached past him and unscrewed the eye bolt that held the rope ladder. 3 turns of the bolt and it came free. The whole ladder dropped into the creek below. Darren turned around. He was not reaching for the rifle. He was looking at me in a way I could not immediately place. Not frightened, not angry, assessing. "He's gone," I said. "The road bridge is 400 meters north. The creek is carrying things you do not want to be in the water with. You need to go." He looked at me for about 5 seconds. Then he went to the inner hatch and went through it into the maintenance corridor. I listened to his boots on the corridor floor. The north hatch opened and closed. The service ladder on the pier took his weight and then released it. Then, there was only the creek. I stood on the platform for a couple of minutes in the rain. The water below was 20 centimeters below the platform floor and rising. The debris coming through was heavy now. Sections of roofing iron, gas cylinders, furniture, whole sections of fence. From upstream, I could see a solid wall of moving material that was not going to slow down. I went inside, picked up my pack, took one last look at the space I had built, and went down the north hatch. The service ladder was underwater at the base. I went into the creek chest deep. The current hit me sideways, and I grabbed the pier face and worked along it hand over hand on the anchor bolts, around to the downstream side where the current was less direct. I got my feet under me and moved east along the bank, pushing through lantana and brush with the pack held above my head. I crossed to the far bank 200 meters downstream, where the channel bent and the current eased. The water was at my waist, cold, and carrying things I felt bumping against my legs that I chose not to look at. I reached the east bank and climbed up to a concrete embankment access ramp and sat there. The bridge behind me was still standing. I could see the deck silhouette against the overcast sky, and below it the lighter surface of the flood moving through the span. The shelter was up there, still attached to the soffit. The tins, the stove, the second gas can, the sleeping mat. The flood would decide what it did with all of it. I opened the pack on the ramp and checked what I had. The pump action with one shell, the knife and the hammer, the binoculars, the water bottle, stove, one gas can, antibiotics and the first aid kit, the notebook and a pencil. It was enough. I had spent 5 weeks building something I was proud of, and I had left most of it behind in 4 minutes. The part of me that had been satisfied about the shelter, the part that kept thinking about how clever the rope ladder was, and how well the water collection worked, and how nobody would ever find it. That part was not there anymore. It had been replaced by something more useful, a clear sense of what I needed to carry, and what I needed to keep moving. The bridge was a good shelter, and I built it well, and it kept me alive for 5 weeks. The problem with it was that it was a place, a fixed point. Every day I stayed in one place, I was assuming the place would stay safe, and that assumption held right up until it did not. I moved east along the embankment under the motorway overpass, keeping below the guardrail edge. The shamblers above on the road surface were moving in a loose group along the traffic lane. I could hear that low collective sound they made when there were enough of them in one place. I stayed in the shadow below them and kept moving. I had 2 tins left in the pack from the grab, a tin of tuna and a tin of corn. I ate the tuna cold against the embankment wall, using the knife as a spoon. It tasted of tin and salt, and I ate all of it. There was a business park about 1.5 kilometers east that I had scouted twice in previous weeks and left for when I needed it. Commercial buildings, concrete floors, steel roller doors, several still padlocked from the outside. A padlocked building was one that had been secured before anyone left it in a hurry, which sometimes meant it was clean and unused and had not turned into a problem. I reached it before dawn. I went around the perimeter on the outside, checking each building face through the binoculars. 2 had windows broken from the inside. 1 had a roller door forced up 30 centimeters and left there, enough for something to get in, but not easy for something to get out. The 4th building, set back at the end of the park, was fully sealed. I checked the padlock on the roller door for 2 minutes. No score marks, no bending on the shackle, no sign of anyone having tried it. I knocked once with my knuckle. Nothing answered from inside. I used the hammer and the knife to work the padlock off the hasp. 8 minutes. The door went up with some resistance, dusty channel tracks, a swollen bottom seal, and I was inside. It was a commercial refrigeration service company. Parts shelves along 2 walls, a service bench, 2 vehicles under tarps, a small office at the back. It smelled of machine oil and concrete dust, not of anything worse. I pulled the roller door down behind me and barred it from inside with a length of steel rod from the parts shelf. I checked every room and the ceiling access hatch, knocked, waited, opened, and found nothing. I sat on the service bench, took off my boots and checked my feet. 2 blisters on the left heel had opened in the creek crossing. I dried them with a shop rag, put on the dry socks I kept wrapped in plastic at the bottom of the pack, and let them breathe. The building had a small kitchen area with a sink, a kettle, and a shelf with tea, sugar, and several packets of instant noodles still in their sealed wrapping. I heated water on the camping stove and ate 2 packets and drank tea and wrote in the notebook until the pencil needed sharpening. I noted the date as best I could calculate, noted what was in the pack, noted the blisters, and that the antibiotics should wait unless the blisters showed infection, which they currently did not. Noted that the 2 vehicles under the tarps should be checked in the morning for fuel and keys. I did not write down anything about Roy and Darren, or about the family downstream, or about the rope ladder in the creek. I was not ready to put any of that in writing. Maybe later. The rain on the metal roof was loud and sustained, with heavier surges when the wind gusted. Outside, the flood was doing whatever floods do. I was dry. I was inside. I had a door barred behind me. I slept on the service bench with the pump action on the floor next to me and the hammer on the bench near my right hand. In the dark, I could hear the rain and nothing else, which was as close to safe as anything gets now. In the morning, one of the vehicles under the tarps had a spare key in a magnetic box under the front bumper. The fuel gauge read just below half a tank when I turned the key to accessory. There were 6 emergency flares in a sealed toolbox in the tray, a tow rope, and a road atlas from the glove box. The atlas had the coast and the river lines and the ridge lines, and those had not changed. I traced the secondary road I had come in on, then looked at the coast road to the south and the territory between it and the city. I had not been through any of that ground. That was both a risk and a reason to go. I did not start the ute that morning. I spent the first part of the day doing what I had not done properly since leaving the bridge, taking an actual inventory of what I had and what I needed. The pack had been packed in a hurry, and there were things in it I had grabbed by reflex that were less useful than the things I had left behind. I reorganized it, redistributed the weight, and tested the straps for 20 minutes walking back and forth across the service floor. Then I checked both vehicles properly. The first, the service van, had no keys, and the fuel gauge was on empty. The ute was the one worth keeping. I scouted the perimeter road on foot before I started the engine, 300 meters in each direction, checking sight lines, listening for the kind of noise that meant a large group of shamblers nearby. The road was quiet. The nearest sound was the motorway, still and distant in the morning air, with the occasional low grinding noise that large groups of the dead on a road surface made when they moved together. It was far enough away that it was not an immediate problem. I went back inside, got in the ute, started it on the second turn of the key, and drove south. The bridge was behind me, 200 meters of concrete under a motorway, 5 weeks of work, a rope ladder in the creek, and a food cache on a shelf no one would touch. It was a good shelter, and I built it well. I had left it in 4 minutes with a pack and 1 shell in the gun. The bridge had taught me 2 things. A well-hidden fixed shelter buys you real time, and that time is not permanent. Somebody always comes, or the water comes, or something you did not plan for comes. You build it, you use it, and you know from the first day when you should be ready to leave it. I had not been ready the first night they came. I was ready enough. That was what I was going to work on.